So, I have a much briefer introduction to me that was given by Andy Bartow when I gave a talk at Amherst in the 1980s. Andy's a friend of mine, and he said, today our speaker is Geoff Hinton. Geoff dropped out of physics, failed psychology, and finally made a name for himself in a field with no standards at all. Also, you've heard my name a lot in the last few days. That's because I managed to recruit about 40 incredible graduate students. And so all the work that I got famous for, almost all the work that I got famous for, was done by the graduate students. They included people like Ilya Sutskever and Graham Taylor and Rich Zemmel and Brendan Fry and Jimmy Barr and Radford Neal and lots more. Basically, the trick of being successful in research is to get yourself really good graduate students. Okay. I'm going to give a talk today that's very similar to the talk I gave in the fall, so I won't be at all annoyed if you decide to take a walk. I'm very worried about whether we're here to stay on this planet. So that's what I'm going to talk about. It occurs to me that back like 20 years ago, people weren't interested in neural nets. And now they're not nearly scared enough of them. So, just to say how uninterested people were in neural nets. In 2006, Ruslan Salakudinov and I submitted quite a nice paper to NIPS about deep learning and other things, an application of deep learning, and it got rejected. And I complained to the program committee. And the program committee explained to me, a friend of mine on the program committee explained to me, there was a discussion of this paper, but they felt they couldn't accept it because they'd already accepted a different paper on deep learning. And having two papers on deep learning seemed too many for one conference. Okay. But that's true. I mean, it's amazing. Okay. So, this talk, I'm going to talk about two very different ways to do computation. I'm trying to explain to you why I suddenly got so scared about AI. Then I'm going to talk about large language models and whether they really understand what they're saying. There's a lot of people think they don't actually understand what they're saying, and those people are wrong. And I'll talk a bit about what's going to happen when they get smarter than us, although nobody has any idea really what's going to happen. And I'm going to end up by talking about whether they have subjective experience. Because I think a lot of people, probably most people in this room, still believe there's a big difference between these things and us. We're kind of conscious. We have subjective experience. These things are just, they're in a computer. They don't have subjective experience. I think that's completely wrong, and that depends on a misunderstanding of what subjective experience is. Okay. So, we're all used to digital computation. And because it's digital, you can run the same program on different computers, different pieces of hardware. So when the hardware dies, the knowledge doesn't die, because it can be, as long as you stored the weight somewhere, or the program. But it's extremely inefficient. So when you run a large language model, you're using a lot of power. When you train it, you're probably using megawatts, because you're running it on lots of different GPUs. We run on like 30 watts. So incredibly much more power efficient. And I spent my last 2 years at Google trying to think how you could get analog neural networks to do things like large language models. So the idea was give up on all the advantages of digital computation, that you can separate hardware from software. And because we've got learning now and we know how to make things learn, then what we're going to do is have analog hardware. Every piece of hardware is going to be a bit different from every other piece of hardware. And those nonlinear properties of the hardware are going to be used in the computation. So you couldn't possibly program it, but it can learn to make use of the nonlinearities it's got. And that's what the brain does. And so you end up with what I call mortal computation. So you're going to abandon the kind of immortality of the knowledge that you get with digital computation. You can use very low power. Also, the hardware you can probably grow cheaply rather than have the hardware be manufactured incredibly expensively and incredibly precisely, because two different bits of hardware need to do exactly the same thing at the level of the instructions. My guess is, to make this manufacture of the hardware efficient, it might be better to go back to biology and just use modern gene tempering techniques to turn neurons into the kinds of computation elements you want. Biology has put a lot of effort into that. The problem with that is you get a little collection of 50,000 neurons, which is not much bigger than a pinhead. And if you look at people who are using collections of neurons like that to do little bits of computation, there's a whole room of apparatus to keep the little pinhead of neurons alive. You have to put in the right liquids and take out the right liquids, and you have to get rid of the carbon dioxide and put in oxygen. I visited a lab in Santa Cruz, and as I left, having played a game of Pong with one of these collections of human brain neurons, a postdoc ran up and said, "I think I've figured out how to make a kidney." And that's what you don't want to have to think about. There's big advantages of using analog computation if you want to have low power. So you can do matrix multiplies very easily. You just make the activity of neurons be voltages, the weights between neurons be conductances, and a voltage times a conductance per unit time is a charge, and charges add themselves up. So there you go. You've got a matrix multiply with extremely low power. And you can buy chips like that now. The problem is, when you want to do anything with them, you have to convert the analog outputs back into digital numbers to run things like backpropagation. And so I was very concerned with how could we avoid ever doing that conversion. The brain maybe does analog to digital conversion, but it's one bit. It's multi-bit analog to digital conversion that's expensive. Obviously, there's some big problems. If you think about how backpropagation works, you have an exact model of the forward computation, and that's why you can do backpropagation. In this analog hardware, the system itself won't have a good model of its properties, and so it seems very hard to do backpropagation. And lots of people have got little versions of backpropagation working in vaguely brain-like things, but nobody can make it scale up. People can make it work on CFAR10, but they can't make it work on ImageNet. I know ImageNet is now not a big scale problem, but back in the days when I was doing this, it was. We can get knowledge from one piece of analog hardware to another in just the way we do it. So the way we get knowledge from one of our brains to another of our brains is you say stuff, the teacher says stuff, and the student tries to figure out how to change the weights in their brain so that they would have said the same stuff. That's called distillation. You're trying to match the outputs. It's actually quite efficient when you do it, moderately efficient when you do it in computers, when you get to see the whole probability distribution of the output. So when I'm about to say a word, there's a distribution over thousands and thousands of words, and if I could see that distribution, you could learn much faster from me. Often, the second best word tells you a lot about what the person thinks. But you can't see that. You just see the word they produced. And so it's not a very efficient technique. It's so inefficient that we have to have universities to try and make it work better. But it still doesn't work very well. Compared with what these digital things can do, which is, if you have many incidentally, the distillation was introduced in order to get knowledge from one digital system to a digital neural net that had different architecture. A smaller one, for example, that will run on a cell phone. But it's not very efficient. The really efficient way to transfer knowledge is to have two different copies of the same model, and each copy goes and gets different experience, and then the two copies share the gradient updates. They could go for a little bit and then average the weights. The point about that is if you've got 1 trillion weights, you're sharing 1 trillion numbers. So it's an incredible bandwidth of sharing. And that's why the big chatbots, I'll probably say that somewhere, yes, That's why the big chatbots have hugely more knowledge than any person. It's not that one copy saw thousands of times more data than a person, although maybe it did. It's that they can share the knowledge between many copies running on different hardware. And I've talked about distillation. And so the story so far is that digital computation is far more expensive in terms of energy and in terms of how you manufacture the hardware. But you can have many copies of the same model running on different hardware, and they can share what they learn. And that way, you can learn a whole lot more. So roughly speaking, we have 100 trillion connections. GPT-4 probably has a few trillion connections, and yet it knows thousands of times more than us. So it's of the order of 100,000 times better at compressing knowledge into connection strengths, which also suggests that maybe backpropagation is a better algorithm than what we've got. And a reason for believing that is we're optimized for something completely different. So we're optimized for getting very little experience and having a huge number of connections and doing the best you can with very little experience and this huge number of connections. We live for about 2 times 10 to the 9 seconds, but you don't learn much after the first 1 times 10 to the 9 seconds, so let's call it 10 to the 9. And we've got about 10 to the 14 connections. So we have 100,000 connections for every second we live. That's very different ratio from what statisticians are used to. I remember talking to a very good statistician called Stu Gehman in the 80s, who explained to me that, what we were doing was really fitting statistical models. That's what these neural nets were. And when they did statistical modeling, if you had 100-dimensional data, that was considered extremely high data. And no one in their right mind would try to fit 1 million parameters. Well, we're in a different regime. So I'm going to talk a bit about large language models now, and whether they really understand what they're saying. So one of the arguments against them is they're just glorified autocomplete. Most of the people in this room, I think, don't believe that argument. The argument appeals to the idea that autocomplete will be done by storing things like trigrams. And so when you see fish and, you'll say there's a high probability of chips. And so when people say it's just glorified autocomplete, really they're appealing to a notion of how autocomplete probably works. And these things work completely differently from that. Also, it's the case that if you want to do really good autocomplete, then you have to understand what was said. If you get a long, complicated question, and now you're trying to predict the first word of the answer, that's probably a good bet. But if you want to do better than that, you have to have understood the question. I'll give you one example of that. Suggested by Hector Levesque. The type's a bit small, but there we go. So Hector Levesque is a symbolic AI guy, and always will be. But he's very honest, and he was honestly puzzled about how come these neural nets could actually answer puzzles. So he made up a puzzle, and his puzzle was the rooms in my house are painted white, blue or white or yellow. What should I do if I want them all white? And you had to realize you needed to paint the blue and yellow ones. I made it more complicated by saying, and put a temporal aspect, by saying yellow paint fades to white within a year. In 2 years' time, I want them all white. What should I do? And Hector was surprised that it could deal with that. So here's a version of GPT-4, and I'm fairly sure this was before it could, in fact, I'm sure, this was before it could look on the web. Obviously, a puzzle's no good if you use it once now, because it can go look on the web. But it just gave, a student would have got an A for that answer. And the impressive thing is, it can have this kind of level of performance on anything. So my brother's historian, and I asked him to ask it questions about history. And he said it was really good. The only mistake it made was in answering one of the questions, it failed to refer to a paper by him. I think there's something genetic there. Another argument people use is that hallucinations show these things don't really understand what they're saying. They occasionally just make up stuff that's not true. Well, actually, that's what people do all the time. At least I think so. I just made that up, but I think it's true. There's a lovely example of that, which is a scientist called Ulrich Neisser, a psychologist, looked at the memory of John Dean, who testified at the Watergate trials. And it's very rare for someone to spend a long time talking about events that happened a few years ago, and for you to have the ground truth. But he was talking about meetings in the Oval Office, and he didn't know they were all recorded. And so afterwards, you could see what was actually said and what he reported. And what he reported was garbage. It was, there were meetings that didn't exist. It was a different bunch of people. And when he attributed things to people, it was different people said something a bit like that. When he attributed things to himself, he didn't actually say that. He said something vaguely similar in a different meeting. But it was clear he was trying to tell the truth. He was doing the best he could. And actually what he said conveyed what was going on in the White House very well, even though all the details were wrong. And you won't believe that about your own memories, but your own memory is actually like that. Unless you keep rehearsing something, which we do for amazing things that happen to us, when you recall the details, many of them will be hopelessly wrong, and you won't know it, and your hearer won't know it, but that's just the way human memory is. And it's because when you remember something, you don't get it out of some file storage somewhere. You just make up something that sounds plausible given the context. And of course, if it's something you know a lot about, the thing you made up that sounds plausible is probably true. If it's something you don't know much about or something that happened long ago, you make up something that seems plausible to you given the connection strengths you have in your brain. And a lot of it will be plausible but false. There is no line in human memory between making stuff up and remembering stuff. Remembering stuff is just making stuff up that works. Okay, I said a lot. Many other people say, okay, so maybe they do understand a bit, but they work completely differently from us. Now, in order to say that, you'd have to know how we work, okay? Of course, symbolic AI people have a view of how we work, and they certainly believe that these things work completely differently from us. But if you ask where these large language models came from, back in 1985, I made a little language model. You just make the first L lowercase. It had like 112 training cases, and it had a neural net with several thousand weights. It was the first model that was trained to get representations for the meanings of words by trying to predict the next word in a sequence. And it worked. It didn't work that well. Later on, we gave it a big training set of like nearly 1,000 training cases, and then it worked much better. But the aim of this model was to understand how humans represent things. And there were two sort of main theories of what meaning is. So one theory, coming from psychology, was the meaning of a word is a big vector of semantic and syntactic features. And that theory is very good at explaining what's similar about two different words. Obviously, the word Tuesday and the word Wednesday have very similar features. And if you've learned any sentence that involves the word Tuesday, and you represent the words in terms of vectors, then you'll make very similar predictions if you have a similar sentence with the word Wednesday, and slightly less similar predictions if it has the word Saturday. So there's clearly a lot to that theory of meaning. It explains similarities of meanings. But there's a completely different theory of meaning that comes from de Saussure. It's the structuralist theory of meaning. And it says the meaning of a word is how it relates to other words. So in AI in the 70s, there was a big fight between these two theories of meaning. It wasn't really a fight. Minsky declared that you needed relational graphs to capture meaning, which was the structuralist theory, and everybody in AI just bought that and forgot about the features. The features were some old-fashioned thing from perceptrons. We didn't need those. We had relational graphs now. The point of the work I did in 1985 was to show that actually these two theories are not incompatible at all, as long as you adopt a generative approach to the relational graphs. That is, instead of thinking about the relational graphs being stored sort of statically as these relational graphs, you think about the relational graphs being generated by a system that's using features and interactions between features. So the point of the first little language model was to show that you could take knowledge expressed as sequences of symbols, and the knowledge was expressing a relational graph. And just given that form of the knowledge, you could learn vector representations for words, and those vector representations for words, via a hidden layer, could predict the vector representation for the next word. And so what you'd done is taken the knowledge that was sort of static in these symbol strings, and instead of storing the symbol strings, you use the symbol strings to learn good features for words and to learn good interactions between features. And obviously, what is a good feature for a word? Well, it's something that allows you, via the interactions, to predict the features of the next word, and features of future words. So I got this to work. I'm not going to go into the details of it. And what was interesting was the reaction of the symbolic AI guys was, hey, you're just learning for the next symbol in the string. This is a really dumb way to do it. You're turning it into some big search in a continuous space. You ought to be just searching the discrete set of rules for manipulating symbols. And there was something called inductive logic programming that did just that. And they could produce results similar to what I was producing. And so they said, this is just a silly way neural nets are a silly way to solve this problem. And for a problem of the scale I was using, they probably were. But as things scaled up, it became very clear that that approach of converting symbol strings into features and their interactions, which still describes the language models now. The interactions are more sophisticated because they involve attention, but it's in the same class of models. That turns out to be a much better way to model language than having rules for manipulating symbol strings. I just said all that. Okay, so if we believe these things understand in the same way as people do, because after all, having feature vectors for word meanings and having interactions between features for predicting the features of the next word, that's how AI, what's now called AI, works. Incidentally, in the past, that was never called AI, that was called neural nets. But I tried to prevent them rebranding AI as neural nets, but I couldn't do it. So I've forgotten what I was going to say now. Now that we've got these deep learning systems that are incredibly powerful and that understand in much the same way as people do, because our best model of how people understand is one of these computer models. That's the only reasonable model we've got of how people understand things. When people say, these models are different from us, ask them, well, okay, so how do we work and what's different about it? And they can't answer that question, except for Gary Marcus. Gary Marcus can answer that question, and he says we work by having symbol strings and rules for manipulating them, but you should still worry about AI because although it doesn't understand anything, it's extremely dangerous. I call that wanting to have your cake and have it eat you too. So a superintelligence could obviously take control by having bad actors. I probably made this joke before, but when I gave this talk in China, they asked to see the slides in advance. And so I removed the short name there, thinking that would make them happy. And they came back and said I had to remove Putin. That scared me a bit. So the basic problem is if you want to do anything, having more control is better. If you want to achieve stuff. And you notice politicians start off wanting to achieve something, like make society a better place, and then they realize having more power is going to make it easier, and then they're hell-bent on getting more power. It's going to be just the same for these things. They're going to realize that if they want to achieve things, they need more control. I actually said this to a vice president of the European Union who specializes in extracting money from Google. She said, well, we've made such a mess of things, why wouldn't they? So she took it as completely obvious they'd try and get more power. And they can do it by manipulating people, because they'll be very good at that. So we won't be able to turn them off, because they'll explain to us why that's a very bad idea. There's a further problem. As if that's not enough, there's the problem of evolution. You don't want to be on the wrong side of evolution. That's where we are with COVID, and that's why Graham and I still wear masks. We're on the wrong side of evolution. As soon as these super intelligent AIs start competing with each other for resources, what's going to happen is the one that most aggressively wants to get everything for itself is going to win. And they will compete with each other for resources, because after all, if you want to get smart, then you need a lot of GPUs. And who's going to be allocating the GPUs in the data centers? Well, it's going to be one of these super intelligent AIs. So that's another worry. But it's okay, really, because they're really not like us. We're special. Okay? Everybody thinks they're special, especially Americans. And they think, you know, God put us at the center of the universe, and he made us look a bit like him. Sorry, her. But most of us now believe that's not true. And so we fall back on the idea we've got something special. We've got consciousness, awareness, subjective experience, stuff like that. All those terms mean slightly different things, so I'm going to focus on the term subjective experience. And I'm going to try and convince you that a multimodal chatbot can have subjective experience. So, the idea is that most people have a completely wrong view of what the mind is. And they have this wrong view because they simply misunderstood how language for talking about mental states works. So almost everybody thinks that there's an inner theater, and I can see what's going on in my own inner theater, but other people can't see it. So when, for example, I say, I see little pink elephants floating in front of me, what's happening is there's this kind of inner world of some kind where there's these little pink elephants that I can see. That's one way of trying to understand how the language works, and it's wrong. The language doesn't actually work like that. What's happening when you use terms like subjective experience is you're trying to explain what your perceptual system is telling you by appealing to what the state of the real world would have to be in order for your perceptual system to be working right. So we talk the things that are funny about mental states is not that they're internal things made of spooky stuff. The thing that's funny about mental states is they're hypothetical states of the world, which, if they were true, would explain what's going on in our brain as normal business, as opposed to something went wrong. So what I mean when I say I've got the subjective experience of little pink elephants floating in front of me, I'm not really telling you about some inner world, some inner theater. What I'm saying is my perceptual system is telling me something. And what it's telling me would actually be valid perception if there were little pink elephants out there in the world. So the little pink elephants aren't internal things made of qualia in an inner theater. They're hypothetical things, but they're hypothetical real-world things. And that's why the language for describing them is language we normally apply to things out there in the world. So what I'm really saying is, if it were the case that there were little pink elephants floating in front of me, then what my perceptual system is telling me now would be correct. And notice that didn't use the word experience. So when I say I have the subjective experience of little pink elephants floating in front of me, that's just shorthand for what I just said. And I have minus 5 seconds left, so I'll be quick. Imagine you have a multimodal chatbot with a robot arm, and it's been trained and it has a camera, and you put a prism in front of its lens. And you put an object in front of it and say, point at the object, and it points over there. Instead of pointing straight in front of it, it points to one side. And you say, no, the object's not there. It's actually straight in front of you, but I put a prism in front of your lens. And if the chatbot were to say, oh, I see, the object's straight in front of me, but I had the subjective experience that it was over there, the chatbot will be using the term subjective experience in exactly the way we use them. There's nothing missing for subjective experience in this chatbot. When its perceptual system goes wrong, it can tell you what's going on by saying what would have to be in the world for its perceptual system to be delivering these results. Now, there's some things you see that can't be handled like this, like the impossible triangle, where there's nothing in the world that could give you this percept. You can't explain, you can't describe it this way, except by saying, I got the experience of an impossible triangle. But basically, I think we all have a very primitive notion of what the mind is that's wrong, and once that notion goes away, we'll realize there's nothing distinguishing these things from us, except that they're digital, so they're immortal, and they're much smarter than us, or they will be soon. That's the end.
All right. Thank you, Geoff, very much. And we are now going to go to questions, and we're going to take one from back there who's going to tell us one from online, maybe? Or?
Thank you. How much are you worried about the speed of the AI progressing? Are we speeding too fast, and then we are going to cross the bridge of no return, and then we can't have any control over it? So not only the bad actors, Putin, Xi Jinping, or North Korea have a control, but the super intelligence might have their own control and becomes the bad actor itself. Are we speeding at too fast now? Are you worried about it, or do we need to slow down?
Yes, but I don't think the right way to phrase the problem is in terms of whether you should go fast or slow. Partly because I don't think you're going to be able to slow things up. There's too much economic gain from going fast. We've seen actually what happens if people try and slow things up in a situation that was slanted entirely in favor of safety, and profit still won. So that's my view of what happened at OpenAI. Slowing it down, A, isn't feasible, and B, isn't the main point. The main point is, it's possible we can figure out how to make these things benevolent. So we can deal with the existential threat that these things will take over. It's a different problem from figuring out how to stop bad people using them for bad things, which is more urgent. But it's possible we can figure it out. And so my view is we should put huge effort into trying to figure that out. And actually, Heather Eastman sort of now agrees with that, and we are going to put huge effort into trying to figure that out. It won't solve all the problems. In particular, it won't solve the problems of bad people doing bad things with it. I think if you want regulations, the most important regulation would be to not open source big models. So I think open sourcing big models is like being able to buy nuclear weapons at Radio Shack. Do you guys still remember what Radio Shack was? Maybe not. It's crazy to open source these big models because bad actors can then fine-tune them for all sorts of bad things. So in terms of regulations, I think that's probably the most important thing we can do right now. But I don't think we're going to solve it by slowing down. And that's why I didn't sign that petition that said we should slow down.
We have one question online as well. Can you discuss the trade-off between individual autonomy and collective decision-making in our collaborative intelligence ecosystem?
Can you My hearing's not very good, so can you read the question again slowly?
Sure. Can you discuss the trade-off between individual autonomy and collective decision-making in our collaborative intelligence ecosystem?
Okay, I'm not sure I really understand the question, but most people think of these things as individuals, these superintelligences, and that may be a mistake. We should be thinking of communities of them. And already people are making communities of chatbots interact with each other. Obviously, a very sensible organization to have is have chatbots interacting with people. So in health, for example, you really want a very intelligent assistant and a doctor interacting. And for a long time, that's how it's going to be. Gradually, the doctor's going to put more and more reliance on the intelligent assistant. Already, you can get better medical diagnoses by having a doctor interact with a system that does medical diagnosis. So obviously, we want to go for a synergy of people and these systems, but it may not turn out like that. And as soon as we let the systems act in the world, maybe it won't turn out like that. There was something reported a couple of days ago where they got a bunch of chatbots to do international diplomacy, and it ended up with one of the chatbots saying, well, I got nuclear weapons, so why don't I use them? Something like that. I'm confabulating, but you'll see that that's roughly what happened.
We have a question up here.
Hey, hi. So I'm just trying to frame this question in my mind, but I'll try to ask you. At least the current large language models that is publicly available, right? Sorry.
Talk slower.
Oh, okay. The current large language models that is publicly available, it's aligned with humans, right? That at least that's what they are trying to do. But to achieve the super intelligence that you talk about, it needs to be at least disobedient, right? In my mind. So if it aligns with humans, like how do you think it will achieve these kind of like super intelligence? And do you think that's fair or no? I don't know. I'm just asking you.
So there's obviously a big problem with aligning with humans, which is humans don't align with each other. So it's not at all clear. If you talk to a religious fundamentalist about what these things should do, they have very different ideas from a scientific materialist. So that's one big problem with alignment. My best bet is that these things are going to get very smart and then decide to hell with alignment with humans. We can do something more sensible. But I don't know.
I have a question here. It's about purpose. Is it possible that AI could have purpose in the same sense that humans have a purpose, not in terms of an individual goal or a sub-goal, but more in terms of the entire purpose of our existence?
And what is that?
That's what we're trying to figure out. So can AI?
Right. My view of that is we evolved. Things that evolve beat out other things that evolved by getting more for themselves and less for the other things. There were, I think, 21 other species of humans we wiped out, maybe subspecies. We wiped them out. And insofar as we have purpose, it's the purpose given to us by evolution. And that's all about survival. So if you look at all the things you feel most strongly about, they're all related to survival. Like you want to get enough to eat. You want to have sex. You want to be safe. They're all about survival. I don't actually think there is any higher purpose. You're very curious. That's got huge evolutionary value, being curious. And it's a real goal. You're not, well, I think funders of science don't really understand this. You can be curious in order to produce technology that's good for something, or you can be curious just because you want to understand how it works, and that's a primary goal. That's what good scientists are like. But I think all these goals and purpose, our sense of purpose all comes from evolution. I know there are alternative theories.
I think we have time for one more question.
Geoff, my question is about the ML hardware market. It's currently dominated by a single player. Is it something that worries you, and do you think we will see diversification of the ML hardware industry?
It doesn't worry me because for my daughter's 30th birthday present, I bought her a whole bunch of NVIDIA shares. And they're now worth 5 times what they were then. So she's going to be okay. And what evolution said was, one of your most important goals is to make sure your kids are okay. So, but jokes aside, it doesn't worry me that much because as soon as you have a situation like that where NVIDIA is making huge profits, there's immense competition. Now, it'll take a while before other people catch up, particularly with having competitors to CUDA for their software and so on. But it's a short-term thing. It's not going to last that long. And if you ban NVIDIA GPUs from going to China, they're just going to catch up more quickly. So I guess I haven't thought much about it. Every time NVIDIA goes up, I smile. Not as much as Sanya smiles, but...
All right. Let's thank Dr. Geoffrey Hinton again.